Israel has a really big challenge in reestablishing deterrence with Hezbollah on that border without escalating. And I think that what we're concerned about here is that that situation could spin out of control. And that's why we're working very hard with the Chinese and anybody else who has influence with Iran to tell them, hey, let's not let this get out of control. Because, yeah, I think we are very concerned about that risk.
EU leaders are calling for pauses in fighting between Israel and Hamas to allow aid into Gaza. It comes as Israeli tanks have been seen breaking down barbed wire fences and rolling into northern parts of Gaza. Israel suggests that is in preparation for a larger ground invasion. Well, let's hear from Frank Lowenstein now, the former US Special Envoy for Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. I spoke to Frank just before we came on air, and I started by asking what we are likely to see as that invasion gets underway.
I think that the Israelis have been sending tanks, obviously, across the border now. I'm not sure the full-fledged ground invasion has begun yet.
Yes.
I think that there's still a big effort underway by the Biden administration to persuade the Israelis to allow more time for hostage negotiations and to get civilians out of harm's way. So, yeah, I think it is probably inevitable at this point, and I think it's going to be, a very, very long and brutal a war with a lot of people, a lot of innocent civilians in harm's way. So I think the longer we can wait and the more civilians we can get out of the middle of the crossfire, the better off everyone's going to be.
It seems like the UK and the US are speaking via back channels to Hamas to try and get both hostages and UK and US citizens out of Gaza. How successful do you think that could be?
I think we've been doing that probably primarily on the US end through the Qataris. Obviously, we've seen them release two American hostages. I would be surprised if Hamas is willing to release many more hostages. So I think that we may see a little bit more progress on that front, and Hamas will certainly be using that to try to buy themselves some time. But I don't see this as being a situation that's going to be resolved in any meaningful way in advance of the Israeli invasion.
Frank, after they have invaded, what next? Will they occupy? If so, for how long? Because there are a lot of problems that come with that.
Yeah, I don't think the Israelis have any intention to occupy Gaza on a permanent basis. I think they'll do whatever clearing they can of Hamas, and then I think they'll stay there as long as it's necessary to get some kind of an international stabilization force in there. I think we in America would like to see that be an Arab force of some sort or a Turkish force, just because somebody needs to maintain order on the ground there and begin to facilitate reconstruction and obviously addressing the immediate humanitarian concerns. So I do see that the next step there is, after the Israelis go, is to bring some other force in there that has the ability to defend against whatever remnants of Hamas are still out there, but can also turn their attention to the humanitarian and reconstruction needs.
That's interesting you say that. So not a United Nations force, but a collective of Arab forces and potentially some Turkish soldiers too.
Well, yeah, I don't think we know now who would constitute that force, but I think a UN force, sort of formal UN peacekeepers, it's going to be difficult to move anything through the Security Council on this, with obviously the Russians and the Chinese seeing the whole situation very differently. So, yeah, I think the UNRWA will play a big role. The UN will have a big role to play there, but I would imagine that the ground force may not be constituted of a formal UN force, but rather some kind of ad hoc force we pull together from the region.
Frank, what objections do you think need to be achieved for the Israelis before they agree to a pause in fighting?
Well, I think the humanitarian situation on the ground is going to be increasingly problematic for the Israelis. They're obviously very reluctant to let significant amounts of humanitarian assistance in. They won't let any fuel in at all right now. And their position publicly is that this is really Hamas's problem, and Hamas has supplies of food and fuel that they should be providing for the civilians of Gaza. And, Hamas is a brutal terrorist organization. They obviously don't care about civilians.
Yes.
They use them as human shields. And so the idea that they're going to somehow or other provide for the needs of those people seems far-fetched to me. And I think it's not in Israel's strategic interest, and I would imagine this is something the Biden administration is telling them. It's not in their strategic interest for this campaign if they're going to have a massive humanitarian problem on the ground in Gaza, especially in areas where they've told civilians they would be safe. So my guess is Israel's going to have to relent on that a little bit and at least allow more humanitarian assistance in than they have thus far.
The political situation in Israel is also unstable. I mean, how tricky is PM Benjamin Netanyahu's situation, given the fragile nature of the coalition government there?
Well, I think right now they have a stable wartime coalition with Benny
Mm.
Gantz in it. So I think that for the duration of the war, in any event, they will have put those divisions behind them and will be focusing, in a unified way on the war. What comes next is really the very difficult question. I would be surprised personally if Netanyahu survives this politically. But again, there'll be a lot of angry Israelis at the end of it. A lot of, I think, the right wing rhetoric of we need to punish Hamas, we need to punish the Palestinians. I think that will have a lot of currency with the Israeli public. So all we can do, I think, from the United States perspective, is hope that the coalition government that emerges out of this war, probably after some kind of an election, will have a different approach towards the Palestinian question than the current group does. Because I think we see a lot of danger in the West Bank of that situation
Yeah.
deteriorating. And if you want to set that on a different course, you're going to need different leadership, I would argue, on both sides, Israelis and Palestinians.
Well, speaking about danger in different parts of the Middle East, how concerned are the US right now about threats and the situation to their military bases in other parts of the Middle East?
I think we're very concerned about it, and I think we're doing everything we can, including air defense systems, to sort of protect our folks. I think we have about 2,500 on the ground in Iraq and maybe 1,000 on the ground in Syria. And that, I think, is where Iran is going to direct its efforts: is asymmetrical warfare conducted by its proxies against our military bases. So I think if that's the limit of the escalation, I think we can probably live with that as an outcome. I think what we're really concerned about is that Israel and Hezbollah will start a war on that northern border of Israel, and that we'll get dragged into it that way. So yes, they will focus on our troops. They will harass us in Syria and Iraq and wherever else they can. But I think we could probably live with that in terms of containing this war and preventing it from escalating into a full-blown regional war.
How great is that danger at the moment, Frank, of an Israeli-Hezbollah war on that northern border?
Well, there's definitely real risk there. My personal opinion is that, based on the way Iran has behaved over the course of the last 15 or 20 years, they're likely to avoid a direct military conflict with the United States. Same for Hezbollah, especially when we have two aircraft carriers right in the Eastern Mediterranean prepared to, really deliver a very decisive blow militarily. I don't think that's the direction that they're going to want to go in. I think, as I said, they'll want to harass us asymmetrically in other parts of the region. That being said, Israel has a really big challenge in reestablishing deterrence with Hezbollah on that border without escalating. And I think that what we're concerned about here is that situation could spin out of control. And that's why we're working very hard with the Chinese and anybody else who has influence with Iran to tell them, hey, let's not let this get out of control. Because, yeah, I think we are very concerned about that risk.
Incredible to hear about those back channels that different governments are having, as Frank says there, with the Chinese and others, to try and get hostages free and to try and stop a wider war escalating in the Middle East. That was Frank Lowenstein there, former US Special Envoy for Israeli-Palestinian negotiations and former US Special Envoy to the Middle East.